Dorothy Dearborn, and I'm here to be your guide as we travel around New Brunswick to meet some of the friendly ghosts that we have in the province. Oh, they're out there, for sure, and so are the people who see them and hear them. They're going to tell us all about them. Join me. When Sherry Foster bought a house on Cannon Street in St. John, she didn't know it was still inhabited. Not until she started hearing footsteps at night. Footsteps on the hardwood floors of the hall and in her studio, on floors not covered with carpeting.
The house has a lot of character, and I've always loved old houses. And when I bought it in the early 80s, he told me that what he knew of the house was that it had been moved from Paradise Row sometime before he bought it. So it has a lot more history than I've been able to research, but I'm sure it has many stories to tell. And one of the other things he told me was that there was a ghost in the house. The front part of the house has an older style to it, and I suspect that when I realized that the walls didn't join in common places, and there seemed to be different thresholds and
It wasn't like an addition put on the house. It was as if it were two houses just sort of jammed up against each other.
So I suspect that the part that was moved from Paradise Row was the back part.
Yeah.
And it has an upstairs. And this part didn't have an upstairs. And so when you look at the floor plan, you can see that there's a bay window here. There's a little bedroom off this living room, and the front door was here. And if you look at this line here, it seems to separate itself from the rest of the house. And always when you'd hear the spirit or the presence walking across the hardwood floor, it would be across these floors, and it would always stop at that threshold.
Now, when you were living there, you had your weaving. You were doing a lot of weaving at the time, and you had your loom in that front part where the ghost came in. Can you show us where that was and how the first time that you had an experience?
I had my loom about that position in the living room. This night, this would be in the mid-80s. At that point when I leaned back on my bench and just to inspect what I'd done, and I felt a hand on my shoulder as if someone was standing just behind me and looking too at the work I'd done. And it was very eerie, very strange. But
looking over your shoulder,
I looked around, and there was no one there. And there couldn't have been, because I was alone in the house. I mean, I lived alone. Nobody snuck in. I always kept the doors locked. And it was just very strange. And but I wasn't afraid. I wasn't afraid.
And your guest approved?
I would think so. That was the feeling I got.
But when Sherry had a friend come to visit, let's let Sherry tell it.
She was going to spend the night at my place, and she was going to sleep in this room. And she got there earlier in the day, and we went out for supper. And when we got back, and we came in the front door, and as soon as I opened the door and we were in the house, in the hall, she goes, "Yoo-hoo." And I said, "What are you doing?" She says, "There's someone here." I said, "There's no one here." And the hair on the back of my neck just stood up. I said, "What are you talking about?" She says, "There's someone here." And we came in the hall and into the dining room. And she was looking over my shoulder. I was facing her this way, and she was looking over my shoulder with this look on her face, like I said, you know, what's up? And she said, she's here. That's her. She's standing right there. And that was the first time I realized that this was a female, because no one had actually seen her. But this girlfriend of mine was very sensitive to this sort of thing. She'd had experiences before, and she doesn't advertise it, but you know, she's rather nervous and shy about it. But she described her as, I guess, almost a Victorian kind of dress, and like a sash with a long sort of A-line skirt, and a blousey, like a white blousey, lacy kind of top with puffy sleeves. And she's an artist too, so she could describe this, and she even drew a picture for me of this woman had like curly hair, almost like ringlets.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
You know?
Yeah.
And she said that she was standing by the window, the bay window, looking out as if she was waiting for someone to arrive. And in the meantime, she would not go into this room, and she would not sleep in that bedroom. So we had to drag the mattress off the bed and drag it upstairs and put it on the floor beside my bed, because she wouldn't sleep in the room. No.
Yes.
And,
but your mother did.
Yes, my mother did on many occasions. And when we were little girls, often we would crawl into bed with Mom in the morning or in the middle of the night if we, you know, were frightened. And Dad was away a lot, and being in the Army and the forces, you know, there was times when he was away for a week or two at a time, and so she'd think nothing of it when, you know, somebody snuggled up against her back in the middle of the night. And she, this one night that she spent the night here, the next morning she mentioned something to me about snuggling in behind her, and I said, what are you talking about? Then she told me that in the night, at first she felt something really cold, like a cold breath, but then she felt this warmth against her back, and she, in her half-wake, half-sleep state, she just equated it with one of us little girls coming in and snuggling against her back. Like, it wasn't someone in my family either, because my uncle owned the house from the early 50s, like he went in around 52 or 3. And, you know, there was no family history of that in the house before that. So it must have been someone else.
Sherry's ghost did not follow her to her new home and studio in Quispamsis, but Jill Stewart's story is quite different. A school teacher, now in Miramichi, Jill's ghost started visiting when she was a child, and even after she was married, he followed her from place to place.
The first time it was when I was walking along a beach, and I thought, when I looked up, I saw my grandfather. But my grandfather had already been dead for a few years by that time. And I thought, oh, it must be just wishful thinking. And as I got closer, he just disappeared. Then, a few nights later, in my bedroom, when I was only 12 years old, he appeared again. And after that, he used to come every once in a while, maybe every second month, third month. There was no real time or allotment there. It used to just happen every now and again.
And how did you finally break the information to your family that this was happening to you?
Well, one night in the middle of the night, I was so sure that this person was never going to hurt me that I decided I was going to find out for sure if he was really a ghost or whether he was a person standing there, and I was too afraid to really decide whether it was a ghost or a person. So I said, I'm going to reach out the next time he comes and I'm going to grab him. Then I'll find out. So, in the middle of the night, I woke up and I could feel his presence. And I lay in bed and I said, "Don't be afraid, grab for him." So I made the big lunge with my right hand, but unfortunately, I grabbed my left hand and I had been sleeping on it and it was dead. Well, I let the awfulest screeches out of me that anybody ever heard on the Miramichi, I'm sure. Anyway, needless to say, it woke everybody up in the household. My mother and father came running down over the steps. My other brothers and sisters, they kept running. So I finally had to say to them, "Well, I have a ghost."
Jill, it's interesting that your ghost appeared to you first near the Miramichi River, and but he followed you. He followed you home to your cottage, and where all did he follow you? What happened?
Wherever I lived, he followed me. He came with me. When we were first married, we had a mini home. He came with me there. He came to me to the house we're living in now. He came with me when I went on my trip to England and up into Scotland. And it didn't matter where I went, he was there.
Well, what happened? You tell me you don't have him with you now.
No, I left him in Scotland. We headed up into Scotland, and when we arrived at the bed and breakfast, it was a quaint old farmhouse, beautiful place, and we were all settled for the night, and I started with the map again, looking at the map, and he came again that night. But he actually even turned the map this time.
For heaven's sake.
And he looked at me, and he was saying, "Thank you, thank you." And that was the last that I've ever seen of him.
Ooh, that sends chills up my spine, Jill. It really does. Just to think that he followed you all the way there and then said thank you and left.
20 years later, I discovered that he was buried not 20 miles away from that bed and breakfast that I stayed at.
And so you were able to bring him back to Scotland and take him back so he could rest in peace.
Yes, that's what I feel, because I've never seen him again.
Jill finally lost her ghost in Scotland, but she misses him. Diane Hodgson is not entirely sure how she would feel if Mrs. King left her. Diane first met her when they lived in Sussex.
She had died in the spring, I think, of 90, and it wasn't until along about October that year that things started getting a little odd in the house. I had, it's an ornament. It was a brass bell, with the anchor, and the bell sits out on a thing, and it was on the end of the cupboard in the kitchen, and one day it started ringing. And I thought, now the kids were small, like 4 and 2 or 2.5 or whatever, so they couldn't reach it. And the cat, there was no way she could get at it. There was just no access for the cat to get at it, so, it was just this ringing bell. So then I have a Christmas cactus here that's as old as the hills. And it always blooms faithfully starting in October, so I had hundreds and hundreds of blooms on this Christmas cactus, and it was in the dining room. And I got up one morning, and the whole kitchen table was covered with the blooms off my Christmas cactus. But in the dining room, there wasn't a bloom left on the plant. Somebody had picked every one of them, and they were on the kitchen. And again, it couldn't have been the children. They were too small. Matt was too small to get out of his crib. And Kelty, we always kept a baby gate across her bedroom door because she wouldn't stay in bed. So she couldn't get out of her room. So we knew that the kids hadn't done it. It was just done. So then after that, it was just odd things. When you go through the dining room especially, the dining room always smelled of lavender. It never had before she died. It was just after these other things started going on, you could smell lavender so strongly in the dining room. And then at night, after I'd put the kids to bed, the apartment was built so that there was a hallway, and all the rooms opened off of the hallway, and every one of them had a door on it. And at night, it would start at one end, and the doors would close all the way down this side and then all the way up the other side. And then after a few minutes, they would open all the way down this side and then all the way back up the other side. And you'd turn off a light and it'd come on, and there were things. So eventually we decided, mostly because of the lavender scent and because Mrs. King had spent so many years in that particular apartment, we decided that was who it must be, because at night, once I'd put the kids to bed, if she'd start opening and closing the doors, I'd go out and I'd say, "Now, Mrs. King, the children need to sleep, and you've got to stop it," and it would stop. So this was our other clue that we decided that it must be her. If I'm calling her Mrs. King and she's doing what I tell her, well, we'll decide that this is who it is. And she just became a normal, everyday part of the house.
After the family moved to Hampton, the Sussex landlord wanted her to convince Mrs. King to stop haunting his new tenants.
When I was going through the dining room, I just kind of looked around and I said, "You know, Mrs. King," I said, "we miss having you with us." I said, "I wish you'd come home with us." And I did it more to ease his daughter's mind than anything else. It was more of a joke than anything. Never thinking. The next day, we were all in the living room. Sunday's usually a quiet day here, and we were all sitting in the living room watching television, including the cat. And Matthew had a bucket of marbles in his room, those great big 4-liter ice cream buckets, and it was full. So you know how heavy that would be. And it was sitting on the floor, so it wasn't like it could fall off of anything. It was already on the floor. And it got tipped over. There were marbles everywhere. So there was no way something that heavy can fall over by itself. And it was just, and I said, "Now this is strange. Yesterday I invited Mrs. King to come home, and today I've got marbles rolling all over my house." But we just kind of let it go and didn't think much of it. But then after that, the same old thing started. The poor cat would come flying down the stairs, and her hair would be puffed right as far as it could puff, and you knew somebody was after her. And Matthew, must have been about 8 at that time. And the way the house is built, there's little like attics on the sides of the bedrooms upstairs. And on one side of the house, they each have one, and it's their toy closets, they call it. And it's big enough, when they were smaller, to get in there and play. And he was in there playing in his toy closet one day, and the next thing I knew, there he come just flying down the stairs. I know he didn't touch 2 stairs on the way down. He was going that fast, and his eyes were just as big as saucers. He says, "I was playing in my toy closet and somebody touched me on the back." And he was just... I said, "Oh, well, now, Matt," I says, "just Mrs. King." She likes the kitchen. She's frequently in the kitchen. I know Michael was standing here in the doorway one day, and he looked at me and thought that I had walked past him, and I hadn't. I was over there, and someone had come through the doorway. But when I get up in the morning, she stands right about here. She seems to be in this area when I come to get a drink of water, and if I'm not expecting her, it kind of startles me a little bit, but most days I'm expecting her. Just the other morning, it would happen to be at 5 in the morning, and I wasn't expecting her, and she did startle me slightly. And she just, when my husband gets up during the night to watch television, she tends to pace back and forth in front of the television quite a bit, but just wherever, I guess, where she feels like being at the moment. But I do find she's more in the kitchen and the hallway than anywhere else. The first sign that she's around is when the cat starts getting a little silly. I mean, she's a Siamese cat who is just the moodiest thing that you'd ever want to meet in your life. But she keeps to herself most of the time, so when the cat is up and moving in the daytime or running and chasing, then that's usually a good sign that Mrs. King's on the move. And I think she likes to tease the cat, maybe, because the cat's so ugly. One day I was in the basement putting on a fire, and when I come up out of the basement, I come right here, and there was a man standing right here, like this, leaning. I couldn't see his face, but the body was very, very clear, but the face wasn't, and he just seemed to be like this. I don't know what he was up to, if he was waiting for a phone call or planning on making one or what, but he just was here. There's more than just her here,
In this
which
house.
is which is why I have the theory that it's not houses that are haunted, it's people. Over the years I've picked up on a ghost here, whatever there, and so I think it's me. I think I'm haunted.
Some people inherit their ghosts. That's what happened with Rita Ferguson. It all started here, in this cemetery at Tide Head, near Campbellton, where her husband's grandfather buried his sister Margaret. From that day on, the Ferguson farmhouse was bedlam. You see, Margaret didn't want to be buried in this cemetery, because it's a Protestant one, and she was a Roman Catholic.
Well, she used to, at night, many of them were awakened by these here strange sounds and motions and things around the room, and they knew right away that it had to be a ghost, and they were so sure of it that they, the next day, that's all we heard. Because, Aunt Margaret walked again, and then they had this here saying, well, if it was in the wintertime, she must have had on her flannelette sheet, because every year my husband used to say, well, our sheet would disappear in the fall and come back in the spring. And then in the summer, apparently, she must have had a cotton sheet that she took off with. Aunt Margaret died. She was an old maid, and she just died of natural causes. And when she died, of course, she had to be buried, and they said she's never been settled after that day, that she still comes back to haunt them. Especially, I guess, probably grandfather then.
The whole family?
Yeah, the whole family certainly have had some meetings up with her in some way or another. And then when we come to when we built our house here, we thought, well, Aunt Margaret will stay over there on that side of the driveway, but apparently she came here too, even when they were building the house. One of my husband's friends was up on the side of the house hammering and putting on the clapboard on the outside, and something landed right beside him, right near his head. And he was scared to death. He came down that ladder and he said, that's it for me today, he said. So he's throwing things at me. He said, no one threw anything at you. So he just said, oh, that's Aunt Margaret. And he said, and you can have Aunt Margaret, because I'm not doing anything more today. And so he left. Anyway, and he was here another night when we were here, and a group of us were playing this game inside here. There were 4 couples, and Aunt Margaret came to the little knock came to the front door, and one of the ladies said, there's someone at the door, you going to let her in? And Vern said, no, there's no one at the front door, because there's no steps there. How can she get to the front door? Well, she said, there's someone there. Oh, he said, oh, that's just Aunt Margaret, that's our ghost. Well, she took off, and that was the end of her. Wouldn't have nothing more to do with that.
But she's not the only ghost.
No, well, they figure that their maybe his grandfather, they say too, they heard him walking. They heard him walking upstairs when he, at night when he was looking around to see that they're all in bed. That was one of the things that they had to, everything had to be in ship shape, and everyone had to be accounted for and all this stuff. And so he too walked, and especially down the hall. There were 4 bedrooms down the hall. And you'd hear him down there, checking them all out. And Dave was my father-in-law, and after he died, his daughters, who was here visiting in the summer, they always came in the summer. Most of the family spent their summers there with her mother and all of us here. And she had these 2 children, and when she went to bed one night, she said, I was so tired and everything else, and she said, Dave came in the room, and she said he spoke. And she said Dave was one who always had his hands going, and he'd give you a slap on the, like that. He was a great guy to emotion when he was talking and everything else there. And I guess she came too, and it scared her. But she said, I had nothing to be scared of or anything. I don't know if he came back to her again, but he never ever bothered me or anything.
Do you think all 3 of these ghosts have moved in here to this house?
Well, I don't have any. I don't seem to have any. Although I do, some nights I hear sounds there, because I'll awaken and you'll hear something, and I'll get up and look around to see if there's anything moving or anything or outside. But I put in a security system, and the ghost can't get by it.
When Rita and her husband were building their new home near the family farm, the Ferguson family ghosts let it be known they had no intention of being left out in the cold. 2 RCMP officers and their wives were witnesses to the event when Aunt Margaret knocked on the front door before the steps and stoop had been built. Representatives of the law are not strangers to ghosts in Woodstock either. Paul Hansen spent years putting up with Benny Swim's hijinks. Of course, you could hardly blame Benny for haunting the Carleton County Jail. Even a murderer might be justified in thinking that 3 dates with the hangman were cause for undue stress.
Benny was in love with a girl named Olive Swim, who was his cousin. And they came from out back of Heartland, Coldstream area, Rockland, not sure just where. And she married a fellow by the name of Harvey Trenholm and moved from the Coldstream, Rockland area into an area below Woodstock called Benton. Well, Benny was still deeply in love with her, so he decided that he would go down and reclaim her, so to speak. And anyway, as a result of that, he traded his fiddle with a fellow in Coldstream, Ed Esterbrooks, for a pistol, and made his way down by train and by horse and wagon to Benton, and found where they were living and murdered the two of them. And he left the scene and proceeded towards Debec, and he got into this farm, and he had tried to kill himself, and Sheriff Foster was able to track the blood in the snow and found out where he was. And when he found Benny, why, of course, he was naturally arrested, brought to Woodstock, and went to court and was arraigned for murder and housed here at the jail until he was eventually hung. This is one of the original cells of the jail, and in all probability, there's 6 of them, and Benny would have probably been housed in one of these, possibly this one. This is where the hanging would have taken place. This is the yard that the judge mentions in his summary after the fouled up hanging of it couldn't have been more public if it had been in the town square. And with Maple Street just a few paces away from us, this is where the gallows is believed to have been erected, and the window up there would have been to the floor of the gallows, and the body would have dropped down, and the sheriff and the members of the panel that was here would have taken the body into that hallway, and there they determined that he was still alive, and then he would have been taken upstairs again for the second hanging.
And through the window once again, and down through.
And down through.
And then I guess they left him a little longer this time.
They left him
to be
a total
sure.
of 19 minutes,
19
and a different hangman.
Yeah.
They had 2 hangmen.
Yeah, a sober one, I think, the second time.
Well,
wasn't it?
I believe he must have
More
been.
sober.
The more sober of the 2. And, of course, the story goes that with Sheriff Foster was crying when the body was brought in, and he said, "My mandate is that he's to be hanged by the neck until dead, and we've got to hang him until he's dead." And that's why he was hung the second time.
Personally, I don't blame Benny one little bit for haunting this jail. I mean, if I were Benny, I'd be haunting it too. Let's go see where he haunted. You had some experiences yourself with what could have been, I put in quotes, Benny, and one of them relates to this spot up here in the kitchen where the sink used to be.
Right. Used to be a double sink. It sat here, and the stove was just over to our left, and we would come up at midnight and put the kettle on to make a cup of coffee, and you would leave and go out and come back, and the water'd be running. The kettle'd be boiling away, but there'd be the water running. Well, you wouldn't leave the water running. You fill your tea kettle up and turn the water off. And there's different times you come up. And this not only happened to me, it happened to other officers too. On occasion, they would come up and, who left the water running? Her. I thought I turned the water off. And then there was also the lights. The lights was of course, we all do that at home too, but come in, turn the lights all off, go downstairs, everything be quiet, and come up. Who left the light on? I thought I turned that off. And this would happen different times with people.
Yeah. But Benny did like water, didn't he? Because didn't you have another experience? Perhaps we could go downstairs and see what happened.
Yes, down in the shower in the
Yeah.
basement.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, this area here had a shower. And this area was designed for showering inmates when they were in segregation. In the course of the duties of a supervisor, we had to do an inspection of different areas of the jail. I come down here one morning and I could hear water running. I come back here and there was water on cold and the water was flowing profusely. So I turned the water off. I went back and signed the logbook and I checked to see who done their last inspection, and went upstairs and checked with the other staff and to see if anybody had been down there, and nobody had been, and nobody had been for a few days, I guess. Nobody housed in the cells down here, and yet the water was running quite freely, and it was cold water. Okay, this room here, we kept inmates' personal property in. When they come in, when inmates admitted, all their personal effects are taken from them, and they're changed into jail clothes. And the personal clothes are washed and stored up here in these different bins. So I was up here one night, and there must have been an inmate getting released in the morning, and I was getting his stuff ready to have it all ready for the day shift. And I would have been in there a few feet, and suddenly this loud bang, like a piece of 2x4 or somebody dropped a plank on the floor right out here in this hallway. And I stopped and I came back out and looked, and I thought I might have knocked something over or something was ready to fall over, and there was nothing to be seen. And I looked around, and we had two-way radios then. So the officer working downstairs, he had heard the sound. So anyway, I left the area and went downstairs, and he said, "What was that noise up there?" And I said, "I don't know what it was." And still don't know what it was.
Was it you, or was it one of the others that was up here one time and thought you heard a voice?
That was another officer that heard that, experienced that. And he talked about that, about feeling this feeling on the back of his neck like a spider web or something, and then thought he could hear a voice, "Come on back, come on back." But that was his experience, and he was telling us about that.
Was it you or one of the other jailers who really heard him one night?
It was one of the other officers who was related an experience of being, I believe, on this floor and hearing footsteps upstairs, which would be on the second floor. And this incident apparently occurred when he was working alone, and he could hear footsteps on the second floor, and as he went around to check why everybody was asleep, and there was nobody upstairs. There was no inmates housed upstairs at that time.
Not just public buildings, but public areas can be haunted. Such is the case at the Keenan Bridge at Johnville, one of New Brunswick's famous covered bridges. Anne Brennan and Frances Cullen tell us the story.
Welcome to the Keenan Bridge. The Keenan Bridge was built in 1927, replacing an older bridge that was built earlier on by the early settlers who came to the area. When they built the new bridge, they sort of changed the road, straightened it out so that it would meet the new bridge at this particular point where we stand now. When they were digging the post holes for this bridge, they uncovered a human skull, which led to great speculation. There were no other bones except the skull. From that point on, we sort of went from story to story until we ended up with a covered bridge that's much used, much loved, and much revered by the local people, but also carried with it a tremendous ghost story. And the pattern of the ghost spirit seems to be that it's a woman figure and that she usually joins people driving through the bridge. In the olden days, of course, it would have been by horse and carriage or more horse and wagon in the country area. And she would get on at one end of the bridge and drive to the other end of the bridge. And I would say a number of people have had this particular experience of being accompanied through the bridge, but she always leaves them at the other end of the bridge. There was one particular loss in the community that sort of added credibility to the story, that in 1903 there was a particular older lady who disappeared and her body was never found. So speculation was, when they found the skull, was it in fact that particular woman? But that being put aside, I think that the bridge itself seems to maintain its own ghost spirit, a woman figure who every once in a while sort of appears to people and adds more credibility to the ghost story.
I came here 63 years ago to live in Johnville, and of course in the beginning I heard stories about the Keenan Bridge being haunted. My father-in-law framed that bridge. He was a carpenter, and he was building barns. He was a barn framer, actually, or that sort of thing, and big buildings, and in the old-fashioned way with the heavy timbers. And they asked him if he thought he could build that or frame it, and he decided he'd try it, so he did that. And while working there with another man, they were digging to put in the cribbing back in the bank, and a human skull came out on their shovel. This I'll say because this doesn't concern anyone really. And they didn't know what to do with the skull, and they went and got their what was called a roadmaster at that time, their boss. And he told them to dig a hole up on the side hill and bury it deep. And that's what they did, and he told them not to mention it, and they didn't. They never mentioned it. When they did find the skeleton, a skeleton, later on, many, many years later, it was a headless skeleton. The head wasn't with the skeleton.
Well, the bridge itself crosses over the Muncourt Stream, which is itself steeped in legend and myth, both Aboriginal myth and local myth. One of the stories that I'm familiar with is that the Muncourt Stream was a place that the devil wouldn't cross. And I think in the Keenan Bridge, you can really feel the spirits, whether they be, for me, comforting. I hope for most people comforting, the water spirits, the earth spirits, and the elements coming together to join.
Yeah. Oh, I have no fear in the world of the bridge. I'm not afraid of ghosts. I'm not afraid of ghosts. I've seen some strange things in my life. Now, I mean, people doesn't believe this, but it's true, I have. And I do feel there was something in the bridge because there was too many people had experiences there. There had to be something. They weren't all liars. There was one man, especially many years ago, his sister was married and lived up next door to me. He lived over across the bridge. And this was in Sunday afternoon in the sunshine. He had a horse and sleigh, and he was going up this road to visit his sister on Sunday afternoon, and when he came through the bridge, no one but himself, and the story is, when he got through the bridge on this side, there was a lady all dressed in black sitting in with him. And she sat with him, and the horse was terrified, and it more or less ran away and raced up, and she apparently disappeared down here, somewhere around our gate on the road, and he went on up and turned the horse into his sister, and he fainted and fell in the door. Now that's the story, true or false.
It's only appropriate that the final ghost story should take place in Fredericton, New Brunswick's capital city. There are a few questions, however. The first one is, do ghosts have rights? Is that why this ghost haunts the premises of the Human Rights Commission on Brunswick Street? Susan Kennedy doesn't think so. She believes the ghost is looking out for the rights of the working woman. He seemed to be scolding her whenever she was working late at night.
Generally, it would be on an evening where I would be working past midnight, and I would be working here at the computer, and I would get the sensation of someone watching me. And, you know, kind of, if I would have had hair stand up in the back of my neck, then it would have stood up. I grew up in an old farmhouse, 150-year-old farmhouse, in the country. It's never, the supernatural or any of those things have never scared me. It's just, to me, it's just part of life. It's something that I say, okay, it's there. I have an open mind about it. No harm has ever come to me. So it's a matter of fact, I guess, would be the best way to describe my feeling about it. So I would have the sensation of someone watching me. And I would turn my head and look at the door, and there would be no one there. And on different occasions, the sensation was that strong that I actually would get up and walk around the building and saying, anybody here? Anybody here? And nobody would be here, of course. And then one night, I was working, and I'd say it was around 2 in the morning, and I was thinking, okay, Susan, you've got to finish up here, and you've got to get home, because you have to get up and go to work the next day. There's a commission meeting the next day. And I had a thought and a report that I was writing, and I wanted to finish that thought. And I got the sensation that I was being watched, and I turned very quickly. And there was the apparition outlined in the door, not the whole body, but half the body, almost in the sense that he was peeking around at me. And you could very clearly make out the watch and the watch fob, the chain. And the watch wasn't quite in the little pocket in the vest where it should be. And it was as if he was chiding me about working so late. Or maybe he was, you know, like, get out of my space. I'm waiting for an appointment, or, you know, maybe this was his den. Maybe it was Judge Barry. And he was waiting for me to leave so that he could come in and do his work. I don't know. But it was never a threatening sensation that I received. Never, I don't even want to say spooky, because it wasn't spooky. It just was. I did move my office at one point in time. It was down a little further down the hallway. I didn't see the gentleman, but I did sense his presence in the foyer area here on the second floor. When I moved back, about, I would say, 4 months later to this office again, it was a little while before I actually saw him again. And then whenever I was working really late, he would make his presence known. And at some point in time, if I had several nights where I was working late every night and I didn't see him, then I would say, okay, what's going on? Where is he tonight? Why hasn't, he shown up? And it was almost like I was inviting him, because then later on that night, he would show himself. He smiled, I smiled. That's the level of our exchange. Now, that same summer, we had a lot of students here. And they were all housed. Their offices were on the 3rd floor. And after the fact, I put 2 and 2 together, because none of the students would come in and work at night alone. They came in 2s and 3s and more. And I often wondered if the 3rd floor was where he actually was, and he just wandered down to the second floor to see who was here. But I never received, when I would go to the third floor, I never had any sensation of anything being there. One of the interesting things that did happen here in the office was the fact that this workstation was larger. It was more of a table than the credenza that it is right now. And I had space to stack my reports. And they would be large piles of documents, of papers. And I would work late and would leave here, and everything would be nice and neat and nice square lines, you know, and nice neat stacks of paper. And I would come in the next morning, and the top 2 or 3 pages would be just enough askew that I would wonder, where did that breeze come from? Who moved my papers? You know, we have the sensation of someone touching our stuff. Well, who touched my stuff? Since my work was very legally based, I often wondered if maybe the apparition, my friendly gentleman, might have been Judge Barry. And he may have been looking at my findings and wondering the determination. That's one possibility. It could have been just, maybe my apparition literally just came in and looked. Whoever he was.
Is it the ghost of Judge Barry, who, with his sister, lived in this house for so many years? Is he determined to defend the rights of women here, in the place where human rights are defended daily? This time, you be the judge. I'm Dorothy Dearborn. Good night and good haunting.